introductions for our keynote speaker, Julia F. Weber. I'll provide a brief introduction and Ms. Julia will begin to speak. So Julia F. Weber has spent her career developing innovative approaches to solving complex issues facing families, children, and communities. She consults with national, state, and local agencies and government entities and regularly speaks on domestic violence, firearms violence prevention policies, child custody, and the implementation of promising practices to prevent violence. Julia has trained hundreds of judicial officers, court staff, attorneys, victim advocates, and mental health practitioners, and has drafted and successfully advocated for many firearm violence prevention policies with a focus on equity and inclusion, including the allocation of $40 million in California state funding for implementation of civil firearm prohibiting remedies. We are super honored to have her expertise here today, so now please give a hand to Julia.
I'm going to take you back a little bit to about 1940s, where we're looking at another time when we had a major public health crisis starting up. And at the same time, a public education campaign that was designed to create a certain kind of reliance on a product that was unsafe. So many of you, of course, are living through a time where smoking is way down. Let me go back here. Are we sure the sound's working? I'm going to try it. Let's see. No. All right, so we're going to sort of rework this because the sound is not working for the slide presentation. But no worries, there's plenty to cover. So this is a time in which about 80 years ago, the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company introduced a print and radio advertising campaign for its cigarettes. And one of the recordings that I had here was a radio ad talking about how healthy it was for you to smoke as much as possible, especially for your T-zone. Your T-zone was taste and throat. This is a time where they were arguing that it was better if you were pregnant to help with relaxation, to stay less anxious during the pregnancy, and pushing even Santa Claus promoting smoking. So his sort of ho, ho, ho of smoking there in the radio ad goes into more detail, citing the sort of personal right to smoke being grounded in our culture. We also know that we've seen a similar campaign to promote your health and safety by encouraging access to firearms. And you can see here an early ad that focuses on women. As customers, you're safer with a firearm. You also see here this idea that firearms can save your life. So it's very similar to this idea that we saw with the cigarette companies. And of course, over the course of time, we have fundamentally changed our relationship to smoking in this country, in part because of the recognition of the impact of smoking, not just on individuals, but the community at large, right? So we have much more limits in terms of smoking in public places. And even when we look back at this ad, you can see sort of similarities between this notion of an industry promoting healthy habits by ensuring that you are armed, similar to connecting you to smoking years ago. There was a saying that developed with Second Amendment enthusiasts and gun owners that God didn't make men and women equal, Colonel Colt did. Colt being the firearm manufacturer, still in business, responsible as one of the manufacturers of the AR-15, in particular the weapon that was used in 2018 at the Tree of Life shooting at the synagogue in Pennsylvania. They killed 11 people. This is not an easy topic, as was mentioned at the outset, and I work with survivors every day, and with people whose loved ones, children, spouses, parents, friends didn't survive being shot. But one of my mentors, colleagues, heroes, former boss, I was with Giffords Law Center where I established the implementation program, is Gabby Giffords, herself a survivor of gun violence back in 2011 when she was doing Congress on Your Corner in Tucson, Arizona. I'm from Arizona, so Gabby also has a special place in my heart in terms of the Arizona connection, and was shot, declared dead, and made it. And if you haven't seen the documentary, Won't Back Down, I highly recommend it. It's about Gabby and her husband, now Senator Mark Kelly, and their establishment of Giffords. So we know this is a difficult topic, and we know that many people in the room have personal experiences. So please take care of yourself as you're listening. We can make a difference, we can move forward, and I'm gonna hopefully give you some hope and reason to move forward collectively. So, as has already been mentioned by the Assembly member, firearm ownership is prevalent. This is a typical picture of many of our metropolitan areas in California. We have a lot of cars, right? We also have even more firearms. So more privately owned firearms than any other country, and far exceeding the number of cars. And we've seen a huge increase in firearm ownership, especially during the pandemic. One of the things I want to really highlight is that we are not talking about all firearm owners. Gabby Giffords, for example, and her husband, Senator Kelly, are firearm owners. I work closely with folks who own firearms. If you're in the service profession, you should assume you are working with people who have access to firearms. But we're talking about people who may be at risk of harming themselves or others because of the access they have to firearms, and who we as a society generally believe should not have that kind of irresponsible access. So right now, 4 in 10 US adults say they live in a household with a gun, including 30% who say they personally own one. In California, we believe about 4.2 million people or more own firearms, and about an additional 3.1 million live in homes with someone else who owns a firearm. What's the number one reason people own firearms? Personal protection. And since we're talking about the intersection of domestic violence or dating violence and firearm, that's particularly important, because the idea that you are safer with a firearm when you are experiencing family violence, domestic violence, intimate partner abuse has no foundation, okay? It doesn't stop the industry from telling us that you are somehow safer with a firearm, but we have to arm ourselves with the knowledge, with the information about what the truth is in this area. We also know that firearms are connected to a variety of lethal outcomes and injuries and trauma. This is a memorial that Giffords set up a couple of years ago showing the over 3,400 people who died as a result of gun violence in 2020. This was in San Francisco. This is for those who died in California during 2020. I think what's even more interesting in terms of really looking at the data and the impact is not only the loss of life, but the number of people in California who have had what we call an EV. That's an experience of violence that Dr. Garen Winton out of UC Davis talks about. The majority of Californians have some experience of looking at a sidewalk memorial, hearing gunshots, losing someone to a violent incident involving firearms. And we know that too many of these folks are also young people who should be in a position to be developing confidence in their community and in their institutions, and are instead living with fear. The industry specifically focuses on building a customer base. Similar to the smoking industry, the tobacco industry, Big Tobacco had to produce a set of customers, of clients, consumers who will purchase the cigarettes. Similarly, we have the industry developing things like the JR-15, which is a AR-15 style weapon designed for children, for young people. And it's one of the things that we've been litigating around, and the governor's been concerned about here in California, is the messaging that goes with this kind of outreach to young people. Now, the argument that the industry makes is that it helps inform young people, making them safer and understanding how to use firearms. But there's no question that it also makes it look appealing, that you're somehow going to have fun, be empowered by having firearms. And we see this similar kind of push for women owning firearms in contemporary advertising. So in 2021, 5.4 million people purchased firearms for the first time, and more than 33% of those purchasing firearms were women. So this brought over 1 million women into gun ownership during that time. And the National Sports Shooting Foundation, which is sort of the NRA of today, I would argue, they reported a 77% rise in female gun ownership between 2005 and 2020. So I spent a lot of time training judges and people who work on child custody cases directly with families. And it's really important to understand that the myth of a gun owner only being male and involved with criminal activity, those are assumptions that we have to push by the wayside. Many victims of domestic violence have been convinced that they should become firearm owners to protect themselves. And yet, we know that it's not as this, you can see the advertisement, right? There's this sense that you are going to be harmed by a stranger, right? That being concerned about sexual assault or other types of assault, that you're most vulnerable outside your home. But all the research contradicts that notion for women. In 2022, the last year that I currently have numbers for, around 48,800 women and girls were killed by someone they knew in their own family, which is more than 5 women or girls every hour. In 2018, 92% of intimate partner female homicides in the US were committed by a man the victim knew, and 63% were committed by husbands. So we need to have at least a basic understanding of domestic violence for today's conversation, and I know many of you do. You are engaged in important work in this area. The whole area of domestic violence is quite complicated, and there are multiple definitions. The one that I use the most, that I find most comprehensive, is one developed by a woman named Barbara Hart, who was a leader in the battered women's movement in the 1970s that led to some of the earliest firearm prohibitions. So the assembly member mentioned red flag laws, what we call gun violence restraining orders in California. Those are actually the least protective firearm prohibiting remedy we have in California. Because in California, we have had domestic violence, firearm prohibitions in place long before the rest of the country. And I'll go into some more detail about that. But we need to have them because of the intersection of domestic violence, access to firearms, and dangerousness. So what is it about domestic violence that makes it so dangerous? This is a quick domestic violence 101, as we say. First of all, domestic violence generally includes rules and a rule maker. That's pretty consistent across all the various ways that domestic violence is perpetrated. The first rule is I get to make the rules. That's the person who is exerting the power and control in the relationship. The rule maker, the perpetrator, the batterer, the person who's doing harm. The next rule they usually have is there will be no separation. You cannot leave, which is a form of what we call in the law false imprisonment, keeping somebody captive under your control. The next rule is you can't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone about what I've done, what's going on in our relationship. And the next most common rule is be loyal. So when you see these rules in place and you imagine someone trying to get a domestic violence restraining order, or just leave the relationship, or telling someone who's a service provider or an advocate, you can see they've broken just about every one of the rules, which is one of the reasons domestic violence is so dangerous, because the thing that keeps all of these rules in place is the threat or actual use of physical, emotional, sexual, financial, psychological abuse, and actual violence. When you introduce firearms into that situation, we know how much more dangerous the situation becomes. So we have 4.5 million women in the US who have been threatened with a firearm. The presence of a firearm, regardless of who owns it, increases the risk of a lethal outcome when a man is perpetrating domestic violence and a woman is the victim. Increases the risk of her dying by the use of that firearm by 500%. And there's the ongoing threat. Having done family law work for 25 plus years, I can tell you many of the cases just involve pointing to the firearm on the table, pointing to the safe, cleaning the firearm, never pulling it out and pointing it at the victim, but just knowing that the firearm was there to reinforce the message is a form of violence that's associated with easy access to firearms. Now we hear a lot about the tragedy, the horrific tragedy of mass shootings, including children who have lost their lives just going to school. One of the things that I don't think gets enough attention is how often children are harmed in the context of their own family. So domestic violence impacts children and youth within the context of their own family. We're talking about in 2022, just some more statistics, at least 866 kids ages 17 and younger were shot in domestic violence situations. 621 of them died. At the same time, 268 children were shot at school, 75 of them fatally. Horrific. Any loss of life, any harm and trauma that's resulting from easy access to firearms is completely intolerable. And we have to draw attention to this lesser known area where children are being harmed and unsafe in their own home. We also know that domestic violence isn't always taken seriously as a dangerous phenomenon. We spent decades treating it as a private matter to be resolved between the couple with separation, mediation, low intervention from the state. There's some advantages to that in the sense that people are often embarrassed and afraid, and advocates really push us to understand that survivors need to drive and shape the remedy. We can't just say state intervention is the best way to go. But when we don't take reported domestic violence seriously, the results can be deadly. And we see that with over 2/3 of mass shootings having some connection to domestic violence. So the Pulse nightclub incident, for example, his former partner talked about the level of violence and abuse she was subjected to. So over 2/3 of mass shootings connected to domestic violence means we have to do more to take domestic violence seriously, not only to protect that individual victim, children and family members in the household, but the community more broadly. Similarly, what we're here today to talk about is the level of teen dating violence. So if we're looking at a statistic like 1 in 12 teens experience domestic violence, we have to say no to that and respond appropriately. We also know that when we're talking about homicide and dating partners, dating puts you in a higher risk category because of half of all intimate partner homicides are committed by dating partners. But here's the good news on the same slide. There's something we can do about this. The right policies, research shows, decreases the risk of homicide and domestic violence cases involving firearms by 16%. So we gotta have the right tool in our toolkits. And we have them in California. And there's a lot of them. We have incredible remedies that are designed to specifically address firearms and domestic violence. I'm gonna start first, this part with the federal policies. So under federal law, there are a bunch of ways you can become prohibited from having a firearm: having, possessing, owning, purchasing a firearm.